So hello everybody. Do I have a remote? Okay. Just a few words about me. I'm the CEO and CTO at MindMagnet. We are a development agency founded in 2005, and we have 30 plus developers. Our activity focuses on both Magento and custom PHP. And my background is in PHP, as a PHP developer, and in the recent years as a project manager. We are also the organizers of Meet Magento Romania. So just a quick disclaimer. This presentation is not a complete description of the Agile manifesto, not a full presentation of Scrum or Kanban, and it's not the perfect recipe. What it is, it's a brief presentation of Scrum, our implementation of it, and tips from our experience. So, the projects. Each project generally falls under one of these two categories: development projects and support projects. Development projects have a scope of work, they have a clear timeline in weeks or months, requires a team that is fully assigned to the project, and ends with a release, a final release of the project. Support projects have an unpredictable workflow. They always the deadline is ASAP, tomorrow, today, and therefore requires developers part-time and not in the sustained manner. And this is an ongoing project. How many of you prefer the first type of project? I believe, yeah, most of you would prefer that. But both are profitable, both make money, so we need to do both types of projects. Many times the second projects come right after the first project is the same project, is just in a different phase. So therefore, at MindMagnet we have two developer pools: developers who are on development projects and developers who are available to be assigned to development projects. And a few tips on these pools. Try to assign support work to the available developers as much as possible in order to keep the developers working on development projects uninterrupted. You'll of course have developers who are very experienced in some types of situations or are very experienced on certain projects, and they might be required consistently. So our tip is to decide on a day of the week you want that developer to be available for those types of projects. It can be each week or every other week. And we generally prefer Wednesday because it's not Monday when we have planning meetings, and it's not Friday when we have demos. When developers finish their development projects, they go into the available pool, and then they can be reassigned from there to other development work or to be used on support projects until a development project pops up. And don't overbook your resources. Otherwise, your available developers will run thin, and your support projects will suffer. If your support projects suffer, then pretty soon you'll end up taking off developers of development projects in order to help with those projects and get the clients off your back. So a couple of words about the Agile values. Individuals and interactions over processes and tools, working software over comprehensive documentation, customer collaboration over contract negotiation, responsibilities to change over following a plan. And the key principles, there are 12. I picked out 4 I really like. Welcome changing requirements, even late in the development. Deliver working software frequently. Build projects around motivated individuals. And working software is the primary measure of progress. You can find out more about this on the Agile Manifesto ORG page. So I'm going to start with the development projects, which we organize using Scrum. This is the typical Scrum workflow. I'm sure you're familiar with it. It has a product backlog, a sprint backlog, which is basically a set of selected tasks from the project backlog that will be handled in the current sprint. And then it goes into a 2-week iteration of development, at the end of which you have a demo and a potentially shippable product. These are the roles in Scrum, and I'm going to talk a bit about them. So it's the product owner. He's the one who adds items to the backlog, sets priorities on the product backlog, and the only person who talks to strangers. There's the Scrum Master, who makes sure the framework is respected, removes obstacles, identifies and manages conflicts, and empowers the team and helps them to improve. There's, of course, the development team who do the work. They deliver incremental of the product over each iteration. They own the sprint backlog, so they make decisions on that backlog. And ideally, it's a team of 7 plus minus 2, and it's recommended not to exceed 12. It's self-organizing, empowered, and generalizing specialists. I'm going to go into more details on the generalizing specialists a bit later. And there's also the optional role of the sponsor, which empowers the Scrum Master and the product owner. For example, at MindMagnet, I am the sponsor. I'm making sure that the development goes smooth. I give the product owners the power to make decisions, the Scrum Masters the powers to make decisions, and I'm making sure the framework is respected at the levels of the Scrum Master and product owner. So how we go about projects? Generally, the first step is we receive the client requirements. We go in and discuss it, his vision, his requirements, his goals for delivery. We really try to understand what the client is after. And then we propose a solution and agree on a ballpark, which is money and delivery time. This is just a rough ballpark. After the client finds that acceptable, we break down the project into epics. And these are a few examples done in a post-it design, like the traditional Kanban board. And these are the epics we generally assign rough estimations on, which can be 1 week of development, 2 weeks of development, half a week of development, so are very rough estimates, but in total give us a good idea of the timeline the project will have and the general budget it will end up being in. Then, when we start the development of the project, we break down the epics into stories. So one of those epics can have different stories. And then finally, when the development actually happens inside the sprint, the developers have the freedom to break down the story into their own tasks, which are very technical and are not the problem of the product owner. So a couple of words on the definition of done. Done is done. This is the most important rule for us at least, which means that if we formulate a story and if we formulate a task, whenever we say the task is done, the task never returns as not done. It might have bugs reported on it, but it's important to report the task as done when we consider it shippable. So here are a few examples. A task might be done when the acceptance criteria is met and the code is committed and pushed to the story branch. And a story might be done when all subtasks are done, acceptance criteria is met, code is reviewed and approved, and the code is merged into the dev branch. You might also want to define the definition of ready, but you can look this up and research it. So the sprint, which is the essential part of the Scrum. It starts with a planning stage, which we break out into two plannings. The first planning meeting is where the product owner, generally at MindMagnet we put a strong focus on the product owner, so the experienced project manager is generally the product owner. And he discusses with the team and asks for certain stories to be done by the end of the sprint. Then the team goes into Scrum, they discuss it, they do the poker planning, they assign estimates. Poker planning are done with, traditionally with a deck of cards, which have the Fibonacci numbers on them, and developers estimate each of the stories, and then agree on a certain complexity and estimation of that story based on one of the stories which is picked out and agreed that that is, for example, a 5-point estimate, and then all other stories are compared to that one and reported as 3s and 8s. And for example, if developers one developer picks out a card with 8 and the other picks out a card with 3, then they start discussing what their thoughts are on that implementation. It's possibly that one of them is thinking an over-processing solution, over-engineers it, and the other doesn't see the complexity behind it. But through this discussion, they can reach a certain point, and when they vote again, they're going to have a common estimate on that task. Then the team commits on a certain set of tasks that they will deliver in that sprint. So a sprint might have 60 story points. Based on the total number of story points, the stories would add up. And they commit that that delivery will be done in the 2 or 3 weeks the sprint has. Then the team, with the Scrum Master and without the product owner, have the daily stand-ups, which is a 2-minute, 3-minute meeting where everybody on the team says what they done the previous day, what they're going to do that day, and if they have any blockers on they would need addressed. It's not the meeting where you would discuss problems you have with questions or anything. Those are discussed afterwards directly between two developers or the product owner and the developer. It's important to keep those meetings short and not have the entire team blocked on that. Then at the end of the sprint, which is usually on Friday, you have the sprint review and demo. This is a very important part of the sprint, and it was something that we neglected initially, having a demo to the client. The whole point of the Agile is getting often feedback from the client and seeing if your development is on track and you deliver what the client requires. So it's important to have a demo on every other week at the end of the sprint. And then the team goes into a sprint retrospective, which can be done over a cup of coffee, where they discuss things that went well and didn't go well in the sprint, and what they could improve to increase their efficiency in the next sprints. We use JIRA inside the sprint, so after the project is broken up into epics and stories, then the developers use this Kanban view, where they drag their tasks and stories from to-do into in progress, and finally when they complete it, they drag it into done. The priority on this is to focus on the tasks that are done. So in Agile, tasks that are in progress, which are tasks you invested time in but haven't completed yet, are considered inventory, and it's advisable to avoid them. So the priority must be to move as many things into done and have as few of tasks and stories inside the in-progress status. There are also some teams that organize in a way that they set a limit on this, so you can't take a new task from the to-do list until a task is moved out of the in-progress list. So a few tips. As I mentioned, done is done. Always have the demo at the end of the sprint. It's important to get the client feedback and make sure development goes on track. Never force the team to commit, so at the beginning of the sprint, don't try as a product owner to push the team to commit to something they're not comfortable with committing. Never extend the sprint. I heard some people say, well, we can't really make this sprint, so why don't we add another couple of days on that? That should never be done. Expose problems and don't cover up overruns. So if, for example, you're due to errors in estimates or problems with communicating in the team or certain team malfunctions, you end up having overruns. Don't try to put in extra hours in order to cover them up, but expose them and discuss them in the sprint retrospective. It's better to expose the problems than to mask them under an extra effort in delivery. This is something that's typical to us. We like to have the product owner inside our company. If you have a client which is very familiar with Agile and has training in this, you can have the product owner inside the client's company, but we generally prefer to keep it inside our company because he's familiar with Agile. He knows how to break up the epics into stories. He knows how to communicate with the team his requirements, and is always easy to get a hold of. So, for example, if you're working over time zones and your product owner would be in the US and you're here in Europe, your team would need to wait hours in order to get a hold of the client and ask a question. So it's better to have the product owner inside your company. We like to have the Scrum Master be one of the developers because he's very involved in the team. He can get a better understanding of the team dynamics and how they can be improved. And respect the framework, which actually means hold the meetings, have the planning, have the daily stand-ups, and then have the demo and review at the end. And we like to have the developers do their own QA work. Otherwise, things tend to bottle up in a bottleneck at the test stage. So the developers move from to-do into in progress, which would break up into in development, and then when they complete it, they would move it to test. And that task isn't done until it's moved to done. So that creates a bottleneck where only the QA can take care of that. So we like to have all developers do the basic QA. We don't require them to do the documentation and the test plan, but we want to have them to do the QA and make sure something that they label as done is something that's actually done and pretty well tested. On support projects, we use the Kanban board with more statuses. So for example, we go for to-do, which is a new task that's coming from the client. Then the developer pulls a new task into in progress. Then he moves it into in review. And then perhaps if the client likes to make deployments at a certain time, it moves into pending deployment and finally to done when it's deployed to live and it's gone. After that point, the task is considered completed and then anything else related to the task is actually a new task. So you can define this however your team or projects need it. We have a few projects where we have less statuses or more statuses depending on how the client flow functions. And it's really useful to have a centralized view. If you have multiple support projects, 10, 15 support projects, some of them have constant work in it, some of them have occasional work in it. A centralized view allows your developers to see what support projects they have pending tasks on, and they can take that on. Allows project managers to see what the progress is on tasks and set priorities between projects. And if your solution has an interface facing the client, it allows the client to see the status of the task and the ETA on them. If your favorite tool isn't doing a centralized view, you can use a classic Kanban board, which is a wall with post-its. Or with JIRA, for example, we use their API in order to implement a solution where we bring out the outstanding tasks and list them in a centralized view. So a few tips on the support projects. Same thing, done is done. Promise deadlines you can keep. Never unassign developers from the Scrum project. Try always to find a day in the week when they should be available and plan those projects Scrum accordingly, or use the developers you have available in the pool. Check the definition of ready when you receive a task, right when you receive them. Things like working credentials, like required resources, like the task is clear. It's always good to take time exactly when you receive the task, review everything, and make sure that by the time the developer pulls the task, he has everything he needs to take care of that. Otherwise, he would get to start on that and he would say the FTP details aren't working, or there's a missing layout, or the task is unclear, and then the task remains blocked in that status and the developer can work on it. As I said, try to use available developers. And now I'm going to go over a list of advantages of Agile for developers. It requires the whole team to understand the client. And this is a major advantage because when you understand the client's requirements, you're able to make decisions and make recommendations based on your experience and overall deliver an overall better product. Makes the whole team responsible, good and bad. Whenever a sprint is failed, we don't point fingers at what developer didn't complete his assignment that week. It's a team's failure. And same goes when the results are good, it's the team's success. And this creates a collaborating team which works together in order to deliver a final result, and they help one another. Creates a flat structure inside the team, so there aren't hierarchies of lead developers and junior developers. Everybody works at the same level, and this creates a feel of empowerment. The developers make decisions, they don't execute, and therefore the end result is something that they put their fingerprint on. And this is something very important, especially for experienced developers. They don't want a job where they just go in and execute and execute and execute and don't make any decisions. So it's something that's very satisfactory for developers and creates the self-organizing collaborating team. With this sprint and with the measures taken in the sprint retrospective from a week to another, or from a sprint to another, the team works better and better. They work faster and faster, they have an increased velocity, and each sprint they deliver more story points. Advantages to the client. It shows very quick and tangible results in delivery, not just reports. So you don't have months go by and you just report certain tasks are done, and then put off the demo in 2 weeks after development. The client can go pretty nervous if 2 months pass and he hasn't seen something tangible. Allows for scope change late in the project, and this is great. One of the values in Agile is welcoming change. So it's okay for the client to change his mind. We've all been there, and in the traditional waterfall model, we are discouraging that kind of behavior. So we're trying to define a clear specification and then respect that plan, whatever happens. In Agile, it's better to welcome change, and the final product will be something that's better suited for the client's needs. Allows to calibrate the effort based on budget. So there are many examples when certain functionality can be achieved with 2 days of work or 2 weeks of work, depending on how complex of a solution we're thinking about. So doing an agile way and discussing it with the client and saying, look, we plan to deliver this at the end of the 2 weeks. The client will say, only this, why not more? Then we can go into the details, explain it to him, and maybe find out that certain functionalities could be much simpler than we initially anticipated. And quickly delivers a usable minimum viable product. So we encourage our clients to launch as soon as possible rather than put in 8, 10 sprints of development into a product before showing it to anyone. We encourage it to launch sooner and then add certain functionalities on top of that, whenever that is possible. Developers develop the client's ideas using their know-how. So the clients benefit from this know-how. Developers might be experienced with working on other projects, from using other projects, and they might pitch in with ideas of how they can make this product better, and the final product would be something the client would be happier with, and maybe it would be even more tailored to the market with the developer's feedback. An agency is proactive with the client's needs, with offering good solutions which might take less of a time than initially expected, with improving the client's ideas, with allowing him to change the scope late in the project. We are proactive with the client, and we work together with him into delivering his project. So this was it. I think I went a little fast, but fortunately we have time for questions. Yeah. Yeah, sure. No, we have a QA department, and they do regression testing. They do testing after deployments, for example, integration testing, and also before releases, they do a full testing of the project in order to find out things that the developers might have missed. But we want to have the basic testing done by the developer in order for the task they deliver to be done. So for a front-end developer, this might mean to check if the integration is according to the design, pixel perfect maybe if that's a requirement. It works on the browser and all the browsers it requires. He uses the test devices in order to see it looks well on the iPad, it looks well on an Android phone, and this initial testing rules out many of the bugs. Yeah. That's a good practice in order to developers test each other's code. At us, the developer who makes the code does the initial testing on things that are trickier and might hide errors. We either have another developer test it or even assign the QA inside the sprint for a test on that specific functionality. And also, for example, if we have a team and the developer is responsible for merging stories when they are completed into dev, that's the point where we introduce code reviews. So whenever the lead developer takes the completed story from a developer on the team and merges it into dev, that's the point where he does the code review. So that's another point where quality assurance is made. Perfect. Sure. The key. Yeah. Yeah. This is budgeted. Actually, what we found is that by the developers doing their own test, they actually save a lot of time of the QAs to do the test. Certain mistakes that are made by developer and are missed in that developer testing would then end up at the QA, and we would have that ping pong where the QA just sends over trivial bugs he finds on that solution, something that we eliminate with the initial testing. Also, what we found that the developers, if they're well trained into testing, they're much more efficient into testing small tasks than the QA would be. So the QA would need to go in, read the story, understand the context, and then test. This might take him an hour to test a certain functionality, while the developer who's already in team with everything that's happening there can do it in 30 minutes, for example. But overall, in the project, we budget a certain percentage over the development hours as QA hours. Depends on the project, on the complexity, but somewhere between 15 and 25%. Yes, yes. Yeah. Okay. The project manager takes on the role of the product owner, and we prefer to have it on our team. And he's the one who's in sync with the client, talks with the client, understands his requirements, but is actually in the team and available all day long and able to answer questions much more quickly than a client would. He is also someone who's more trained into answering developer questions than the client would be. The product owner, which is the project manager. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I understand. So on some projects too, we have the product owner on the client side, and we are okay with that approach as long as the product owner on the client side is experienced with this type of thing. But if he's not experienced, then he would probably do a poor job. So I think if the client would not be willing to accept a product owner on our side, then we would designate a project manager who would act as a product owner inside our team and be the single point of contact to that client. We might not be that strict about developers not talking to the client's product owner, since that might be a requirement, but we would have someone who would assist them in that effort. Did I answer it? Okay. Sure. Yeah. Okay. 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 So depends from a project to another. We always like to involve the person who would do the QA on the project. We would involve him in the team. If his workflow would be only concentrated towards the end of the sprint, he might attend or not attend the meetings, but he would be a person who is well aware of the projects, the requirements, and if he's budgeted inside the projects, inside the sprint, he would have a day allocated for his testing, which would probably happen before the demo to the client in order to evaluate the testing. And then what we like to do is every couple of sprints or every third sprint, whenever we have a bigger release, he does a full testing of everything, the regression testing, in order to make sure that certain things weren't screwed up. But yes, the QA has a very good knowledge of the project. I think that's universal. Sure. Well, it's okay to fail the sprint. So, for example, if you had a sprint and you took on 80 story points and you find out you can't do it, it's okay. You can calibrate your effort next week, see what went wrong. Maybe the problem was that certain elements were not clear, and then the product owner, which is on our team, would need to do a better job into finding those out in time for the client. Maybe we would need to allocate research time spikes for certain functionalities, and then the team would be more educated into making the estimates for the next week. It's possible that you would need to increase the team if you see that your initial prediction of the delivery won't be respected, or maybe even switch developers into assigning a better developer on certain tasks that are problematic. But it's encouraged you don't try to do overtime and work an extra hour a day or a couple hours a day each developer in the team, because then you would cover this up and you wouldn't be able to take measures from a week to another. If yeah, in the planning stages, so you start with an epic. You have something that looks like a week or 2 weeks or half a week, and you break it down into stories. We generally like stories to be not larger than a couple of days. And if the story ends up being larger than a couple of days, then probably that would need to be broken up into more stories, into more detailed stories under an epic. Yeah, sure. Okay. Thank you, everybody. My colleague has some poker decks for poker planning that each of you can take on your way out. And also, Kuba will have a few words about the raffle. Yes, here it is. Thank you.